In this video, we're going to take a look at how to build a first program in PLCnext Engineer. Let's get started. So the version of PLCnext Engineer that I'm working with here is 2025 0.3. And to create a project, you can either go to the project templates here and select the controller that you wish, or you can go the method that I'm going to use, which is going to File and New Project. Now, if you create a project from the templates, it will automatically import a controller for you. Because I've done the method of going File, New Project, I have to manually select this controller. So to do this, I'm going to go over here to the components tree, and we're going to expand Network, Axio Control, Devices, Phoenix Contact, Axio Control again, and go to Controller. And then we can see all the controllers that I currently have installed on my machine. Now the controller that I'm working with is off of the PLCnext starter kit. So that means that this is a 2152. And I'm using version 2025 firmware on my controller. So I'm going to select that and then drag this over to the plant tree over here on the left, drop it under the project, and that's how you add a controller. Now, the next thing that I like to do once I've added my controller is I like to set up my project so that it's ready to communicate. So to do this, I'm going to double click on project, and I'm going to change the IP range that I'm working with and change mine to one that matches my network. So in my case, I actually use 192.168.40 dot whatever for my network here. So I'm going to change that now. Or sorry, 41. So I'm going to say look for controllers between 192.168.41.2 to 41.254. And by changing this in the project, it automatically assumes that my controller, if I double click on my controller next, is going to be at that IP address if I drag my controller in after I created that. In this case, I need to change my controller. So I'm going to go to the IP address of my controller and change my controller to 41.90 because that's what my controller is set to. Leave the subnet mask as is because that's the way my subnet is configured. And I'm going to add in my gateway. I can change the name of the station if I wish, but I'm going to leave this one the same in this case. At this point, we have the base configuration for our controller set up. And now we can go on to setting up I/O. When it comes to configuring I/O in PLCnext Engineer, there's a few different ways that we can do this. We're going to take a look at two of those methods now. The first method that we're going to look at is the offline method. To do this, you go to AXC F on your plant tree. And then going over to the components tree on the right-hand side here, we're going to expand network, Axio Control, and we're going to drill down until we find AXLSE, which stands for Axio Control Smart Element. And because I'm using the PLCnext starter kit, my first I/O module is actually a digital output module. So I'm going to expand digital output, and I'm using a 16-point digital output module. So we're going to double click on AXC F so that we get our I/O modules brought up here. And we're going to drag the 16-point output module to slot 1. And then in slot 2, I have a digital input module. Slot 3 actually contains a empty module, which I believe we can find these under System. And we're going to use this AXL SESC. And then the last one is a analog input module, which happens to be a 0 to 10 volt analog input. And this is how you add I/O modules in a offline manner. An easier method, if you're able to get online with your controller, and as long as you have the IP address set up correctly. By the way, you can verify that your IP is set up by pointing at your controller by mousing over it, and you see here the IP address of the controller shows up. If this is correct, you can right-click and say Read Axial Line F devices. What this will allow you to do is connect to your controller online and pull the data from the controller directly. If you haven't logged in recently, you will get a login prompt. You can use the default username and password, default username being admin, and the password is printed on the front of your PLC. In my case, I've actually gone in and configured my own user, so I'm going to utilize that. And then you can say OK. If you have everything correct from your offline configuration, you should see nothing in the action area here. In here, you can see that my digital input module is the wrong version. So it's saying that it's going to replace it. We can say OK. And now we have accurate I/O according to our PLC. Next, we'll take a look at how to start building a program. Next, let's take a look at how to write a program in PLCnext Engineer. To begin with, our programs actually reside on the right-hand side here under the Programming folder, Local, and Programs. As you can see here, I don't have any programs currently created, so I'm going to create one by right-clicking and saying Add Program. I'm going to give this program a name. In this case, I'm going to call it Main. By the way, when you go to name your programs, if you wish to have a space in the name, a space is actually an invalid character. As such, you have to use a underscore in place of a space when you're naming your program. So for example, if I wanted to call my program main1, I would have to put main underscore 1 for my program name. Now we can begin selecting the type of logic that we're going to use and building the actual logic. To do this, double click on your program, and I'm going to use a ladder program for my particular program here. And then the next thing that I like to do is I like to set up my variables to begin with and then start writing my code. So in this case, the program that we're going to build is a simple start-stop logic using one start button, one stop button, a running bit in order to show the running status of the system, and then it's going to control a output for a lamp. To begin, we'll go about creating our variables. To do this, up at the top here, select Variables. And then I like to have both my variables and my code in view at the same time. So I'm going to hit this pin option to pin the editor. And then when I select on code, you can see I get this split screen where I have my variables at the top and my code section at the bottom. Now let's go about defining those variables. So the first variable that I'm going to create is I'm going to create one called DI start. I'm using DI underscore to indicate that this is a digital input. And then by hitting tab, I move over to the type, This is where you would select the various different data types that your tag might be. In this case, we're all going to be using Booleans. And then in usage, there's a few ways that we can set the usage. First thing to note about usage is this determines whether or not the tag is actually available within the programmed logic itself or outside of the programmed logic. Now, because this is a digital input and we want to tie it to our digital input card, we need to make sure that this is actually deemed a external tag. So to do this, we can click on usage and change this to external. Now we'll create our stop button. So I'm going to go DI stop, hit tab, hit tab. I can also change the usage by simply typing. So I'm going to type E for external, and as long as it's highlighted in bold there, by hitting enter, it'll make the change. Now let's make that running bit. That's going to be a local. And you can use your keyboard to navigate around using the arrow keys, if that makes it easier. And I'm going to create a digital output called lamp, and that needs to be external as well. Now I've got my tags. Let's create the logic. To add a ladder rung below here, we're just going to click on a insert new contact. And then if we want to add additional contacts to our rung here, we select the end of the contact that we want to add after, and we can say insert new contact. If we want to put something in parallel by selecting the contact that we want to parallel with, we can select add new parallel. And then if we want to add our coil, we'll insert the coil to the rung, and to make sure that this connects, we'll drag this down. And if we scroll sideways here, you can see that we have the formation of our ladder rung. Now let's add in our tags. So I'm going to select the first command and just start typing out the tag that I want. Hitting the down arrow until I've got the one that I want selected in bold, hit enter. Using the over arrow keys, I can move to the next instruction and add in the tag there. Now we've got our first ladder rung, and it's happy. We can tell that it's happy because there's no red X's or red boxes here. Let's add in our next portion of logic. So we're going to select in the white space, add a new contact. Add a coil. And now we've built our logic. At this point, I would recommend that you save your program. You can do so by pressing Ctrl S or pressing save. Giving it a name. In this case, I'm going to use Demo 1. And next, I'll show you how to connect this to I/O and download to your controller. Now let's test our program in PLCnext Engineer. When you go to create a program, as we have under the components tree on the right-hand side of the screen, it's important to note that this program does not actually exist in our PLC at this point. This program is essentially a program module that then has to be added to a specific processing core in the PLC. To do this, we're going to double click on PLCnext here. And when we double click on PLCnext, we'll see ESM1 and ESM2. These are the two processing cores available on our processor. In order to add a program, we first must specify a task and specify how this task is going to run. So in this case, I'm just going to call my task main task. And by default, it's going to create a cyclic task. So this is a task that will run all the time. Then what we need to do is we need to drag our program under the given task. And now our program exists within our controller. The final step that we have to do before we download our program to the PLC is we actually have to associate the I/O to our I/O cards. So to do this, we're going to expand Axial Line F, double-click on our digital output module, and then by going to the Data List tab, we can see that nothing is assigned to any of our outputs yet. To assign something to the output, we can click on DO Out 1, and we're going to choose the DO lamp from this list. One important thing to note, only those external values that we've created from our main program exist here. So if we select DO lamp, we've now associated that output to this output on our actual PLC. Similarly, we'll go through and do the same thing on our digital inputs. Double click on DI, go to Data List, and instead of dragging and dropping from the list, we're going to type out the signal that we want. So I'm going to select here, DI underscore start, DI stop. Now that we have all of our I/O specified, we can close our inputs and outputs. And we're going to close this window here as well, which displays the PLCnext programs. And we're going to right-click on our controller and choose to write and start project with sources. Since I haven't logged in a while, I have to now log in. And now my code is residing on the PLC. To test this and verify that everything's working, if I click in the gray space here and hit this arrow, it's going to bring up a debug view where I can observe the code running and press my start button. And we can see that the logic is actually executing with the presses of the starts and stops. In the event that I had to make a modification to my code, I could right-click over here where we connected in the first place, turn off debug, and then if I needed to change between, let's say, something like a normally open or normally closed set of contacts, by clicking on the contact that you want to change, you can right-click on it and say iterate through coil types, or you can press Alt F7 on your keyboard and it will change through the various different coil types that are available. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.